It's time for my virtual Jericho with John Mair.
Hello and welcome to a very special My Jericho. It's the first live one for a long time that we'll be doing, but you can watch it on YouTube if you haven't caught it live. Tonight we're going to celebrate somebody who's 100 years old, the BBC, Britain's national broadcaster, not Britain's state broadcaster as some people like to call it. It's the national broadcaster, Britain's first public service broadcaster and still the biggest public service broadcaster in the country. It's having some very hard times at the moment because its budget is severely squeezed and the license fee, and also the license fee is coming up for renewal in about 4 or 5 years' time, and it may not be renewed. Let's first of all look at what the BBC does.
We're on air in 5, 4.
BBC One.
Well, defining the BBC's role involves answering the central question, what is public service broadcasting?
It literally means provide...
Let me rephrase that.
The BBC
Has something for everyone.
Today we've got Professor David Hendy, who's just retired from the University of Sussex. He's written a wonderful, wonderful book called The BBC: A People's History. It's a massive tome. Do buy it, do read it. It's well written, it's comprehensive, and if you want to know anything about the BBC in the last 100 years, that's the place to be. David, let's start off in the beginning, 1922. They got their birthday wrong anyway, didn't they? It wasn't called the BBC in 1922.
Well, it was called the BBC, but not the British Broadcasting Corporation. It started as the British Broadcasting Company. And it started off pretty small and pretty ad hoc, camped in rooms that belonged to other companies just off the Strand, and then eventually moving to Savoy Hill, its first headquarters, which was a pretty kind of ramshackle place that, you know, was full of rats and surrounded by starlings and kind of polluted with the noxious fumes from the Thames. So it started off as a pretty small operation with just a handful of people. And, you know, when it began, John Reith, who I'm sure we'll come back to, said there were no sealed orders to open. In other words, you know, there were no instructions as to what this thing broadcasting was. And the small handful of people who were there had to kind of experiment. It was a very ad hoc approach, and especially because theatres weren't cooperating. Intellectuals were a bit suspicious of this new sort of mass cultural thing. Politicians weren't particularly interested, and the newspapers were pretty well determined that this wasn't going to be a new competitor when it came to news. So basically, you know, you have a handful of people who are trying things out on air in kind of fairly kind of chaotic studios. They try sketches from variety shows, short readings, programs for children, lots of musical recitals with maybe a kind of piano or a very small orchestra in the studio. They start to be a little bit more adventurous. They do what they called at the time stunts, which were really kind of outside broadcasts, live relays from the opera and places like that. Talks were a big area of program, and that could be anything from, I don't know, a kind of a foggy day in London or how to tin sardines to a big series about macroeconomic policy. But you know, and gradually they find their way. But I think the key thing is that even though this seems like a slightly motley collection of programs, there was a sort of an idea that underpinned it all, and I think we have to recognise that in 1922, what we're dealing with, if you think of just the 3 or 4 people who formed the BBC right at the beginning, the creative nucleus, these are a group of people who had really just emerged from the First World War. And that kind of shaped them in lots of ways. So you have, just to mention 3 of them very briefly, Cecil Lewis, who was the Deputy Director of Programmes, had been a fighter pilot during the war as a teenager. And he loved being a fighter pilot. He was exhilarated by it and the sense of mission and so on. But he also despaired at what he saw below, which was the destruction and the death. And he emerges from the war thinking, there has to be a way of increasing mutual understanding and ending his hostility in the world. And he thought it was probably through art and music and literature, but how exactly, he wasn't sure. And then there was John Reith, who had a deeply religious upbringing in a Glasgow home, and he was brought up to believe that he would have to serve God by serving the public in some way, like his mother and his father, doing good works in the city. But he wasn't quite sure how to fulfill this kind of moral, godly purpose, this calling. And then there was Arthur Burrows, who actually knew most about radio, and he'd spent the wartime listening to enemy wireless propaganda and despairing at what he saw as the kind of radio's effectiveness at spreading disinformation, like a poison gas, as he put it. And he thought, well, why, if it can spread disinformation, why not use radio to spread a doctrine of common sense, as he put it. He talked about saturating the ether with truth ions. And if you kind of fuse these ideas together, what you start to see is a kind of an idea. And that's what underpinned even the British Broadcasting Company. There was this idea, inchoate, but definitely there, that radio was the means to an end. It was the means to deliver common sense, rationality, art, music, culture to as many people as possible. And that to as many people as possible was just as important as the rest of that equation. You know, to paraphrase Reith, it was about delivering the best that has been thought and said and done to as many people as possible. Otherwise, how would you heal society? How would you hold society together? You can't just retain this for the privileged few. It has to be for everyone. So there was a kind of idea that was there right at the beginning, I think, even though there was also a sense of sort of chaos behind the scenes.
The shadow of John Reith was there, the Presbyterian, the man from the manse. Is it still on the BBC? You know, educate, inform. Is the BBC still too what's the word, proper?
I think, you know, it will feel too proper for some people and not proper enough for others. I would say it is still there, and we have to kind of look for it in interesting and unusual places, and actually in places that we don't always think of as Reithian. So, for instance, just to give an example, Radio 1, part of the BBC that is traditionally regarded as kind of just like the commercial sector. Why on earth is the BBC doing a pop music station in a way, you know, when, you know, there are commercial radio stations? On the other hand, if you kind of dig into the data, and I'm not particularly one for lots of data, but the average commercial radio station, pop radio station, plays roughly 2,000, just under 2,000 different musical tracks a year. Radio 1, nearly 14,000. In other words, 7 times the range of popular music. So Radio 1, for instance, is not the same. Now, in terms of kind of Reithianism, it is doing what John Peel said in 1967 when he joined, you know, Radio 1, and he played his sort of esoteric music on the margins of kind of popular music. He said it was to introduce people to music that they wouldn't otherwise hear. And in a way, Radio 1 is doing that. Now, it has to combine that with an interest in ratings. Ratings cannot be ignored because, again, if the aim, the ethos, is to bring new material, to widen horizons, to lead popular taste, not just to follow it, then you have to have an audience. You're not going to have a cultural effect. You're not going to have any effect on widening people's tastes or introducing people to new things unless people are tuning in the first place. So you have to be accessible in some way. And that, of course, that's the enduring story in many ways of the BBC, is how far do you lead without losing your following? That tension between kind of uplift and ratings is always there. And in one sense, it can't be one or the other. It always has to be both in tension.
But it took off, didn't it? I mean, BBC Radio became very, very popular in the 20s and 30s. Why?
One thing that, of course, is that the BBC had a monopoly. It's true that, you know, especially after 1933, you have, commercial stations on the continent like Radio Luxembourg and Radio Normandy and so on that are being listened to, especially on a Sunday. I mean, you know, the Reithian influence, if you like, was heard most on Sunday when the BBC was, frankly, a little bit dull and boring in terms of its output. But the BBC essentially had a monopoly, and it also benefited, if you like, from a kind of a spirit, I think, with those who were behind the scenes at the BBC, who believed that they were interested in culture, they were interested in news, they were interested in ideas, they were interested in debates. And Reith is very interesting. In the book that he wrote, Broadcast Over Britain in 1924, he talks a lot about who are the kind of people who should be broadcasters and what is their mission. And in a sense, it had that, what one producer, Lionel Fielden, described as, he said, we really, really believed that we could change human life and change human opinion. And he said, we might have been naive, but by God, we believed in that cause. He also said at one point that, you know, the best thing to think about the BBC at the time in the 20s and the 30s was it was kind of 1/3 Chelsea Party, 1/3 boarding school, 1/3 crusade. And then he said at the end of that, maybe crusade loomed a little bit larger, you know, that sense of purpose, I think, and gradually being willing. And Reith, we think of Reith as a forbidding Presbyterian figure, but he was willing to employ people who he didn't necessarily take to or agree with, but he recognised talent. So someone like Hilda Matheson, who he appointed as director of talks in 1926, you know, brought into the BBC a whole group of intellectuals and thinkers, and she connected the political class and the Bloomsbury set with the BBC and made the BBC respectable. And at the same time, you've got, you know, popularizers like Eric Mashevitz, who's appointed head of Variety in 1933, who's in touch with the musical theatre and comedy, the worlds of music hall and so on. And he injects a kind of sense of this being an organisation which does have its finger on the pulse. And in all sorts of ways, it's a very dignified institution and a very grand institution, but it's not an institution that is ignorant or uninterested in popular taste.
So were they elitist? Were they woke? Were they the first wokeists of the 20s and 30s?
I don't know. I mean, woke is not a term I particularly kind of, you know, take to. I mean, what does woke mean? Kindness. I think that's probably what being woke means, being alert to the feelings of other people. Let me put it this way. The BBC was alert to public opinion. And so, for instance, even by the end of the first year, it was receiving something like 2,000 letters a week. It was setting up a programme correspondence section. It was thinking about what people thought of the programmes. It was responding to that, but not responding in a simple way by saying, this is what people want, therefore let's give more of what people want. I mean, you know, that there's that famous Reithian idea that people don't necessarily know what they want, they certainly don't know what they need, and the BBC is setting out to give people what they need as well as what they want. So I suppose that's kind of a kind of guiding principle for those who are sort of working on designing programs and choosing material and so on. Was it elite? It was only elite in the sense that it was trying to stretch public taste. It was, you know, someone like Cecil Lewis, for instance, who was there as deputy director of programs in the early 1920s. He believed sincerely that if the BBC could introduce people to opera, they would enjoy it and they would kind of come to enjoy it. It wouldn't necessarily be immediate or straight away, but that familiarity to some extent would breed content. And so therefore the idea of introducing on a regular basis things like opera, things like Shakespeare, things like the canon in literature, there was a sincere belief that over time, if carefully handled, not just hurled at people, but maybe with some explanatory context. You know, so you have a series like Music and the Ordinary Listener, which introduces people to kind of some of the kind of acceptable canon of classical music, but explains it in an accessible way. There is that sort of sense in which, yes, we are going to try and introduce kind of what we might think of as elite culture, but we want to take you with us. And it's actually I think that's a kind of important idea. There were plenty of intellectuals, Virginia Woolf and so on, who kind of basically drew a pretty rigid distinction between the highbrows and the lowbrows and despaired of the BBC for being kind of horribly middlebrow. But actually, the middle, if you like, and trying to connect the high and the low was a kind of interesting and challenging place to be.
So there was this tension right at the beginning, which there still is today, between the serious and the popular, populism and intellectualism. That's still there in the BBC, isn't it?
It is still there, and of course it's it's a tension that you can't really resolve, but it's a kind of fruitful tension, I would say. Hugh Weldon, one of the great figures of television in the 50s and 60s, head of TV arts, he said, the BBC's role was to make the good popular and the popular good. And I kind of think that that's a really interesting and important kind of insight into the thinking. And it's not straightforward. I mean, broadcasting is a difficult thing. I mean, not just the kind of technical craft of putting a program together, but thinking about the overall mix of the schedule. And so you have, again, to think about television in the 1950s. Someone at the BBC described it as, the schedule was a bit like a kind of a dinner menu. You'd start off with sort of something kind of light and inviting, and then you'd have a substantial main course, and then you'd have something kind of sweet, towards the end. And that kind of mixed economy, how do you lead public taste but do so without losing your following, is the eternal challenge. And sometimes, broadcasters are more skilled at it than at other times. Mistakes are made. It's a difficult thing to do. And sometimes the least courageous thing to do is to just pitch your tent right in the middle and to be kind of relentlessly middlebrow. And sometimes the solution is to actually say, no, it's a mixed economy, and we're going to have some things which are going to be really challenging and difficult, and we're going to put them there, and it's going to be late night on BBC Two or whatever, and then other things will be kind of more accessible and easy. But to go back to that Hugh Weldon point about making the good popular and the popular good, as far as I'm concerned, something like Strictly Come Dancing is soaked in public service broadcasting values. It's got kindness at its heart, which maybe that's woke, but let's think of it as kindness, that introducing us to the idea that people with different bodies are capable of dancing, for instance, seems to me a kind of wonderful ethos. It's a program that is popular entertainment, but is extremely well produced. The craft and skill levels involved in a live program like that are extraordinary. And so I kind of think that, you can see public service values in programs like that still, I think. And sometimes they don't get it quite right, and sometimes they do.
And of course, it was all radio in the 30s, so the BBC was very afraid of television, even though they're up in Ali Pali. Why were they so afraid of the idea of television?
Well, I'm not sure if I'd say that they were afraid of television. And it's true that they were wary of television. And I think one of the reasons that they were wary of it was that, the first bit of television technology that was being embraced and marketed to the world in the mid-1920s was John Logie Baird's mechanical kind of approach to television. And the BBC's engineers were unsure about whether or not this was ever going to progress to the point where the picture quality was good enough and the production values were good enough and the TV sets were cheap enough for this to be a truly mass medium. Now, radio was already, by the late 20s, becoming kind of widely used. Millions of people were listening to it. Was the BBC, which was an organisation which was ethically committed to the kind of maximum benefit to the maximum number, why should they put their kind of investment into this TV? Well, they did support it a little bit. They worked with Baird and the Baird Company. They supported experimental broadcasts. There were even regular experimental broadcasts from the basement of Broadcasting House in the early 30s. But the BBC were wary until a better system came along, the electronic system that was being developed by Marconi and EMI. And at that point, they could see that television, the pictures would be good enough, and that this might genuinely become a mass medium. So I think, the BBC were wary, they didn't have an intrinsic objection to television. I think they could see that the television age was coming, but they were very wary about whether or not they were kind of, being shackled to the right bit of technology.
So they were firmly embedded in national culture, and then along came the Second World War, which, where the BBC totally came into it. So let's have a look at the Prime Minister announcing the start of the war, shall we? On the BBC.
This is London. You will now hear a statement by the Prime Minister.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Now, David, that was a 6-year war. How did the BBC capture the zeitgeist so well, and why did the BBC come into its own in the Second World War?
I mean, I think that it's a complex picture because the BBC doesn't get it right straight away. I mean, the first thing that happens is the phony war, the Boer War, and where nothing very much happens, and the BBC in fact is kind of poised like the rest of the country for a sudden, overwhelming, devastating attack, and it's also dispersed many of its program makers around the country so that it doesn't get wiped out in one go, all collected in London. So the BBC it's been planning for war, but it's been planning for a war that doesn't quite arrive in September 1939. But it does pretty rapidly then kind of get a feel for what's needed. And I kind of think that this is, what the BBC understands is that, yes, there is a taste and a desire for up-to-date information, that news is important. People want to know the progress of the war. But also broadcasting is important for morale. Right. This is a nation of people living under siege, living with rationing, living with blackouts, living with kind of friends and family away at the front and so on. And also, there's a need for people to feel that experience makes them part of the war effort. Their response to rationing, how they cope with that, is fully part of the war effort, and that also it's going to be okay in the end. And so the BBC kind of responds to that and becomes increasingly agile at sort of sensing that what is needed is reflecting the public mood in all its varieties. There's a mixture of fear, and there's some excitement, and there's trepidation, and there's hope, and there's anger, and there's all of that. And the BBC offers a kind of a mixed economy of emotions, and it learns to be quite agile about kind of judging public taste, through its entertainment programs as well. Entertainment, escapism, and so on. Programs like It's That Man Again, Itmar, Workers' Playtime, which visits factory canteens and kind of essentially puts on air working class music hall kind of culture. It thinks carefully about the accents that it's speaking with, that it brings in the kind of the mellow Yorkshire accents of, J.B. Priestley, and there's Wilfred Pickles on the air and so on. So it knows it has to if it's going to work in terms of sustaining morale, it has to keep the audience, and it has to therefore be much more in tune with the audience. But a very different BBC as well by 1945.
Now you're back totally in sound and vision. There's that tension there which still exists today between propaganda and broadcasting, even to the Falklands War and possibly to Ukraine, where the government says you should be our voice, and the BBC says no, we are our voice. How does the BBC resolve that tension?
I mean, I think that there was a very interesting remark made by Alan Bullock, who the historian who worked for the European service of the BBC at Bush House during the war. And he described the relationship as one of push and pull. And I think that probably is always the case. In other words, the government would always like the BBC to kind of, stick to the script, as it were, and it would much rather the BBC reflect purely the kind of the opinion of the government of the day. And, the BBC's history is full of, attempts by, for instance, Winston Churchill to interfere with the BBC. I mean, he wanted to take it over during the general strike. He would hassle it during the war, and so on. But it's very clear that if you read, for instance, the history of the political warfare executive written by David Garnett, he says that the political warfare executive that believed that it had control of the European service in wartime, that was responsible for directing it and telling it what to broadcast, never quite had full control of the BBC, because very often, you have this sort of debate about that happens at policy level. The BBC had directives from the political warfare executive and from the Ministry of Information and from the Foreign Office and so on, and they were argued with and they were ignored. And the BBC managed, by and large, successfully to argue that even if the government wants to use the BBC to communicate, to project Britain, for instance, then it will only work if the BBC is trusted. And this was an important battle that was won during the Second World War, that generally speaking, even if it couldn't tell the whole truth, it had to be reliable about not telling untruths, and that therefore people would trust it, and if people trusted it, they would listen, and therefore it would serve in the long run to project Britain and British values or democratic values and so on. And I kind of think that, that battle continues. Politicians, by and large, are not very good at thinking in the long term. That the independence of the BBC, editorially as it were, is actually a kind of profoundly valuable aspect of soft power. French journalist Agnès Poirier said, the BBC is Britain's soft power incarnate. And politicians, unfortunately, don't always kind of think in that kind of long-term interest of respecting editorial independence.
But David, even today, it is a political plaything. You've got a chairman of the government who's a Tory, a friend of Rishi Sunak's. You've got a director general who's a recovering Tory. I mean, all governments try to put their people in at the top of the BBC, don't they?
I mean, they do, and I mean, generally speaking, hopefully most of the time, that kind of the balance of, if you like, political appointees on the board of governors, as it was for many years, or the executive or the trust, there is a sort of arm's length principle that these are appointed, and a mix of people from the political spectrum are appointed, and that they should leave their politics at the front door, and indeed, we should have faith that, whether it's the director general or a presenter of a news program, they might well have their own private political beliefs. The BBC principle is that they leave those behind at the front door. And I think that one of the ways in which we do need to be sort of not necessarily suspicious, but maybe questioning, alert, is a kind of broader cultural thing, which is that, the BBC exists in a media landscape which is dominated by a right-wing press. The press in the UK has a right-wing kind of dominance to it. And it's difficult, in newsrooms to kind of protect your own news agenda from the kind of the wider news agenda of the day that is set by the Daily Mail or the Telegraph and so on. And, Robert Peston in 2014, when he was the BBC's economics editor, said the idea that BBC News is, for instance, has a left-wing bias is, and I quote him directly, bollocks. The point he made was that, in the newsroom of the BBC, most people are kind of looking at the Daily Mail and looking at the Daily Telegraph, for instance, in order to kind of reflect what they see as the kind of common sense view of the British people. And I think that's a problem. So to me, it's the cultural kind of centre of gravity within BBC News is as much of an issue as individual appointees, and that it's not that there isn't a problem with individual appointees, and I think we're in a dangerous situation if the BBC says it commits to impartiality as one of its defining features. That's great, but who decides whether something is impartial or not? Who are the people presiding over that is an important consideration. So I think we need to be alert to that, but we mustn't necessarily always be looking in the wrong place. We mustn't necessarily always be looking at kind of a sort of sinister top-down plot. I think there's something more nuanced that we need to be concerned with, which is the kind of the culture of a kind of department or a newsroom.
We're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit there. I mean, one of the things the BBC learnt in the Second War was the value of journalism, value of reporting. The likes of Richard Dimbleby, who actually went to the front and actually reported. That's when news properly came into its own, was it not?
Yes, indeed. Although, of course, Richard Dimbleby had a bit of a hard time in North Africa when he was sort of caught out reporting on what had been happening in the desert, but had been actually reporting from the BBC's offices in Cairo. Yes, it was. I mean, really, it was in anticipation of the opening of the Second Front. D-Day, as it turned out to be in June 1944. It was in planning for that the BBC really thought hard about how it was going to respond. The opening of the Second Front was going to be a major moment in the course of the war. The long-awaited for turning of the tide and rolling back the Nazi occupation of Western Europe. And the BBC knew it would have to kind of rise to this occasion and provide extensive coverage, not just for the home audience, but for Allied troops and for listeners in occupied Europe. And so towards the end of 1942, it starts planning and it creates a war reporting unit, a kind of radio commando unit, as it called it. And it trains a group of journalists in kind of field work, in weapons recognition, in map reading and so on. It gives them a uniform, it embeds them with troops. And so on D-Day, you have these, many war reporters embedded with the troops, going over the English Channel, some on gliders, some in aeroplanes, some on the landing craft and so on. And that you've also had behind the scenes BBC engineers working on developing mobile transmitters that can be carried across the channel and shrinking mobile recording equipment. I mean, at the start of the war, mobile recording meant kind of large, cumbersome trucks, converted Wolseley vans at best. But by D-Day, they'd managed to develop a kind of a wooden case that weighed no more than 40 pounds and had several recording discs and a kind of microphone on a cable, which allowed these war correspondents to kind of carry it with them and record a report from the field, and then eventually for it to be beamed back from a mobile transmitter. And of course, this also meant there had to be an operation back in Broadcasting House to receive this, to record locally, to censor if necessary, to re-record, to print scripts, so a thriving duplicating department that had to work efficiently, and a programme to feature them in the schedule. So, War Report, which became a kind of almost nightly feature until the end of the war, was this sort of marvellous kind of absorbing mixture of news and feature making that because it was almost nightly, kind of really established the BBC as a kind of, a polished news organisation in a way that it had never been before, really.
So it came out of the Second War smelling of roses domestically and worldwide. I mean, the reputation worldwide then and now is still gold standard. Then it had 10 years of the monopoly continued and television came back. And then what happened? What happened in 1955 that upset the apple cart?
Well, I mean, so September 1955, of course, is the launch of commercial television. So we get, I mean, it's not yet suddenly nationwide. It's a couple of kind of local companies, but this is the end of the BBC's sort of monopoly, really, and it's in many ways it's a sort of fundamental moment. It had been brewing for a while since the Conservatives had come to power. It was clear they legislated for commercial television, and I mean, I think that there was a sort of broader cultural tiredness with the kind of post-war era of rationing and maybe this, nanny knows best, and the BBC sort of got caught up with that in a way. This idea that everyone was being a little bit tired of being told what to do and told what to think and so on. So it was an interesting mix of sort of factors that went into the launch of commercial television. But the immediate effect is quite dramatic. That in the next few years, there are many parts of the country, many households where people are watching commercial television more than the BBC. That it sort of starts to win the.
Before you go on to that, David, let's have a look at the first commercial ever on British television, Gibbs SR.
It's tingling fresh. It's fresh as ice. It's Gibbs SR toothpaste, the tingling fresh toothpaste that does your gums good too. The tingle you get when you brush with SR is much more than a nice taste. It's a tingle of health. It tells you something very important, that you're doing your gums good and toughening them to resist infection. And as this chart shows, gum infection is the cause of more tooth losses than decay itself. The tingle in SR comes from sodium ricinoleate, a substance which both dental research and years of use in dental practice have shown to be good for the gums. So, to keep your teeth white as snow, your gums really healthy, and your breath really fresh, see your dentist regularly and brush with SR, the tingling fresh toothpaste for teeth and gums. Gibbs SR.
They don't make them like that anymore, do they? What effect did the coming of ITV, a couple of companies first and then nationwide, what did that effect have on the BBC and indeed on their viewing figures?
Yeah, so I mean, the ratings definitely kind of were affected, and quite considerably, especially actually for sort of children's programs where the ITV were they had some kind of big hit serials on, detective series and cowboy series and so on, but also some kind of BBC style high quality armchair theatre shows and so on, drama and news with the newsreader in vision and so on. And it did, I mean, quite apart from the kind of the ratings for the BBC sliding, it did give the BBC a bit of a kick. I mean, television had always been, if you like, the Cinderella service up till this point. It had relaunched after the war in 1946. It had had 9 years of sort of slow development under kind of austerity. But it was very much the kind of the Cinderella, and radio was the senior service. Now, almost immediately, in fact, actually in some cases before ITV comes on air, the BBC realises it has to respond. And so the money taps are turned on. I mean, the BBC television has now got the money to hire Billy Cotton and big entertainers like that. It knows it has to sharpen up its continuity, its presentation. It has to rethink news. News in particular had been a struggle for television because it was still under the kind of deadweight control of the news people in Broadcasting House, particularly kind of conservative regime at that point. And the television people at Alexandra Palace and later Lime Grove really wanted to kind of develop their own style and their own approach to news. So the money flows, certain amount of freedom, and the BBC does kind of respond. What I would say is that I think we've got to be careful that we don't present a simple story of kind of BBC television being dull and boring and static and unchanging and so on until 1955, and then suddenly it's forced by external competition into becoming something very different. There are kind of, if we delve into the kind of the world of Alexandra Palace and some of the accounts of what it was like there, we can kind of sense a restless spirit of kind of experiment and inquiry. And I want to just, if I could, I want to just read two short quotations from two of the people who were there. One, David Attenborough. He joined the BBC as a talks producer in the early 1950s, and he described, he says this: our discussions over coffee in the canteen were vigorous and never ending. What visually was the best way to change shots? When could we justifiably use music? And so on. And, he's describing a creative, buzzing atmosphere. And here's a second quote, just another short quote from Hugh Weldon, who we've mentioned before, running Arts Television. He said that BBC television in the 50s, this is before commercial television, he said, was a place filled with a very special brand of person. People who were young and vigorous, but who had been in the army, the Navy, or the Air Force during the war. People who had enough experience of quarrels to quarrel very fruitfully for long periods of time without buggering everything up. So this wasn't a static place. This was a place that was organically developing and so on. I think that's kind of important to recognise.
Well, Lord Reith did actually say that coming to commercial television could be like becoming a venereal disease, didn't he? If I remember the quote right.
Yes, I think that's right. I think it was in evidence to a House of Lords committee or something like that he made that remark. I mean, there were many things that Reith, of course, had left the BBC in 1938, and there were many things that he didn't like about the world of television and the BBC and so on from that point onwards. And we can go into the 1960s where he sort of despairs of Hugh Carlton Green and his kind of more progressive liberal approach. And so on. But I think, that the BBC had no option but to respond in certain ways. It had to kind of, the Toddler's Truce, for instance, which had seen the sort of shutdown of television in the early evenings so that, people could send their younger children to bed. It had a BBC rationale, which was that basically, there was the editor of afternoon women's programmes and children's programmes on the BBC said that the BBC would be happy if it had a constantly diminishing audience. Can you imagine a commissioning editor saying that now? And what she meant by that was it wasn't the BBC's job to create a nation of passive radio listeners or TV viewers. There would always be better, more creative, more socially useful things to do. So there was a kind of belief in the benefits of rationing. But it knew that this couldn't be sustained after the commercial television came along, and it was using that period of broadcasting to kind of get people starting to watch. And so off goes the Toddler's Truce, and we have new programs that become sort of more action packed, like Blue Peter and Crackerjack, and in television, Panorama is given an overhaul, and then there's the Tonight programme and so on. So, which kind of mixes up a new approach to news and debate.
Yes, I mean, and they move into sport, and in Grandstand, they realise that it's a sporting nation as much as anything. But did ITV dumb down the BBC?
I'm not sure if that is the case. I think that, and particularly if you kind of think, well, there was almost certainly a kind of a period of nervousness that I think overtook the BBC for a few years. But jump forward just a short period, less than a decade later, you've got the BBC having BBC Two, a new television channel. After Pilkington, the BBC is awarded this new TV channel, and not straight away, but eventually David Attenborough becomes its controller, and you have an extraordinary range of television. In other words, the BBC gets sort of confident again, and jump forward a few years, and you've got Kenneth Clarke and Civilization, you've got Jacob Bronowski and The Ascent of Man, and you have these series at the same time as you have had on the BBC. That Was the Week That Was. You've got the start of Radio 1 and pop music, and Jukebox Jury and so on. So what you've got is that, you've got a BBC that I don't think is dumbing down, but which is slowly widening the range of style and tone. And actually, you've got a changing society as well. Britain is becoming a place where actually, people are jumping between what we might think of as kind of the highbrow and the lowbrow, that they are watching, the Wednesday play, but also listening to kind of Radio 1. They're watching That Was the Week That Was, and Z Cars, and and. So that kind of that mix feels as if it's something with the BBC at its most confident, perhaps in the 1960s, recovers from that kind of initial shock of commercial competition.
But BBC's amoeba-like. It can change to the circumstances. Let's look quickly at Radio 1. Created in 1967 because people are listening to all the pirate radio stations. Let's see, Tony Blackburn, a young Tony Blackburn, set up by the BBC to counter the pirate radio station, but yet hugely successful. Why?
Well, I mean, I think that, part of the reason that it was hugely successful, of course, was that the pirates were just closed down. So once again, the BBC, in a sense, has that kind of luxury of being a kind of monopoly for a while, and commercial radio doesn't really kind of come along until the early 70s. So that Radio 1 has a sort of few years to kind of establish itself on a bit of a shoestring, to be frank, because, it has to share its needle time doesn't expand. Now, needle time is the amount of time that it has the right to play music in terms of payments to music publishers and performers and so on. There were national agreements that restricted this to something like 30 hours or so total a week. This didn't expand very much when Radio 1 started. So, Radio 1 had to share some airtime with Radio 2. Radio 2 had to kind of pad things out. Jimmy Young starts doing recipes because the BBC can't afford for him to play so much music. And the music allowance, as it were, the needle time, is concentrated on those breakfast programmes, Tony Blackburn and so on. He can play a lot of music. It uses up a lot of the BBC's needle time because there's a recognition that, we're in a changing world here. The era when people listen to the radio in the evening has gone. They're watching television, and the new peak time for radio is the morning. And there's a lot of thinking and a lot of agonized thinking that is going on in the background, a lot of research, a lot of number crunching at the BBC about how does radio survive in the television age. And, the kind of in the pessimists would sort of look to the future and say it will survive in the same way that radio survives in America. It will just become kind of a capsule stream of news or of music. And in many ways, the mixed economy of radios 1, 2, 3, and 4 that was created in September 1967 out of the old home service light programme and third programme kind of represent a kind of halfway stage. They're each more unpredictable. Radio 4 is speech, but it's not all news, it's mixed speech. Radio 3 is classical music, but it's not all classical music. There is some speech there and so on. And likewise, Radio 2, for instance, still for a while has Woman's Hour and so on it. So they're feeling their way. And I think Radio 1 clearly developed it drew very unashamedly from the successful formulas of the pirates in terms of the presentation style. And Tony Blackburn kind of arrived at the BBC, and I interviewed him a while ago about his early years at the BBC, and he describes very vividly, arriving and discovering a producer in the studio for the first time. He'd never had a producer when he was on a pirate radio station, telling him what to do, timing every record. And they agreed very, very quickly that this wasn't necessary. His producer would not sort of be there in the studio with him, that he could drive the desk and do things himself and be himself and not have a script. I mean, the BBC was still an organisation that believed in scripted presentation. And so what you get is a sense that the BBC understood that it had to be different in 1967. It had to let go of some of its traditions, and it had to embrace new ways of doing things. And I suppose that, in the end, is why it succeeded.
Like all good programs, we run out of time. We'll then move forward 30 years to the streaming revolution. Let's have a little look at one of the first Netflix promos, maybe just some of it.
You know when you're watching your favourite Netflix show, and after 5 straight episodes, it's like, you want to be in it.
Sir, I think you'll find the information on the senator to be invaluable.
A heartbeat away from the presidency and not a single vote cast in my name. Democracy is so overrated.
Did you say heartbeat?
There we are. I mean, the streamers have been a total revolution. Every cultural secretary says the BBC should be Netflix. Discuss.
Yeah, well, I mean, Netflix is clearly an extraordinary success. I think I have two responses to that. One, first of all, let's remind ourselves that the chief executive of Netflix said once that it was BBC iPlayer that paved the way for streaming services. And that's a bit of history that's, forgotten. When iPlayer was launched just before Christmas in 2007, it did the kind of, as it were, the heavy lifting of introducing the British public to the concept of video on demand and streaming. So the BBC is an organisation which, through its research and development departments and so on, has that kind of cultural capital, as it were, and the ability to take risks developing new technology and so on. So I think that's important. That's an important response. The second response, David, of course, is
it was strangled at birth. The BBC tried to get together another broadcaster, a thing called Project Kangaroo, which was kiboshed by the Government Monopolies Commission. Which would have been
yes, it was. That's right. Yes, the original idea for iPlayer was that it wouldn't just be a BBC thing. The BBC had developed it, but they were wanting to share it with their commercial competitors, because they saw that actually, in terms of public usefulness, a single platform that, to avoid the public having to download lots of different platforms and subscribe to different things, would actually be the best, for the public. But no, that was stopped. Just to go back to your question about Netflix, the BBC becoming Netflix. Of course, Netflix does one thing. I mean, it does dramas. It does sort of films and series. The BBC does that, but I haven't yet seen on Netflix the ability to log on and see what's happening in Ukraine. I haven't yet seen on Netflix the ability to have bite-size school curriculum information, or recipes or information. I mean, BBC does so much more, and this is it's a cliche to say this, but for 43 pence per household, what you've got in that period is multiple TV channels, which include a wide range of programs, including live news, debate, education, music. It funds orchestras, it funds BBC Online, it funds all the radio stations, it funds now the kind of the World Service and so on. So I think this notion that the BBC should be more like Netflix just seems bizarre. And I think the other thing is that Netflix, of course, is a commercial operation, and it will thrive when it's adding subscribers, and it could easily lose its ability to do what it does now if it starts to lose subscribers. I mean, there's a sort of, there's a free market in streaming services out there, and actually in a few years' time, Netflix, who knows, might go under, and it might be Disney Plus that becomes the big streaming organisation. In many ways, what we've got with the BBC is something which, at this point at least, is still reasonably well funded, not as well funded as perhaps it should be or could have been if the licence fee hadn't been frozen for so long. And that universal funding gives it several £billion in order to do good stuff at scale, in order to do the big natural history series that are expensive to make, that David Attenborough presents, and to cover the war in Ukraine in a way that is kaleidoscopic and that offers not just reporting from the front, but analysis from different countries around, reflecting the refugee experience, drawing on the Russian service, the Ukrainian service, the monitoring, the new departments that look at disinformation and so on. That is a much bigger and much more complex machinery than Netflix.
To come over all Christian Murthy with you, what's the future of the BBC in 30 seconds?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, there are real dangers, and the dangers clearly are with the end of the licence fee. I think it's okay if it's replaced by something that is still universal funding. If it's replaced by a subscription fee, I think that's a real danger for the BBC. It either becomes an expensive, exclusive club, or it has to scale back its programmes considerably. So that is a danger. And I think the other danger is public complacency. We've got to not just take it for granted. We've got to be alert to the fact that the BBC is being run down in terms of its income, and there is a sense of ill will towards it from the current government, I'm afraid.
Are you positive about the future, or neutral or negative?
So I would say I'm slightly veering on the negative, and I don't think that's anything that's necessarily innate to the BBC. I think the BBC unfortunately faces a political environment that is hostile. I think the BBC intrinsically can cope with technological change. It's not about radio or television. I think it's neutral about platforms and reaching people. Radio 1 is the largest radio station on YouTube. The BBC is there in these new places. It can embrace the new media. The threat, I don't think, is technological. I think the threat is largely political and financial. And to be frank, and without being party political about it, I think, the way people vote at the next election will determine the future of the BBC in quite a fundamental way.
The secret, surely, is making good, popular programmes.
Yes, I mean the BBC, but the BBC, in a sense, has to kind of hold on to its ethos, and be confident in that ethos. Be confident in being a public corporation. Being confident in that it's ours. And in fact, that short trailer, that sort of BBC self-advert that you started this event with, I think is actually very good, because it's a reminder that it's ours. It's our BBC. It's not the government's, but the government will kind of fool us into thinking it's theirs to do with what they will.
Fascinating hour, David. Let's finish off, if we can, by doing what the BBC is not allowed to do. Let's appeal for some money to keep My Jericho going. It's not my Jericho, it's your Jericho, as we say. If you've got some money down the back of your sofa, please contribute to this and buy the Jericho book. Meanwhile, let's finish off, if we can. Now, next week live, we've got Danny Dorlin in St Barnabas. The ever controversial Danny Dorlin will be speaking live in St Barnabas Church in Jericho. Please come along. It's actually at 6:30 p.m. rather than 6 o'clock, so you don't get tied up with the religion. But let's finish off by thanking David very much indeed. But also, let's have a look at the universality on that ad, the BBC, which advertises itself. Thank you, and see you next time.
Thank you.
We're on air in 5, 4.
BBC One.
Well, defining the BBC's role involves answering the central question, what is public service broadcasting?
It literally means provide...
Boring!
Let me rephrase that.
The BBC
Has something for everyone!